During the previous movies, we've been looking at different types in PHPs. So strings, integers, floats, those are all called types. And we've seen a few times when PHP converted a value from one type to another type for us. For example, we were able to add a string to an integer. And we saw that PHP converted a Boolean true to be the string 1 when it was output to our web page. This process is referred to as type juggling when PHP does it on the fly for us. We can also explicitly set a type ourselves. For example, converting a string 1 into the integer 1. And when we do it, it's called type casting. And we can do type casting in two ways. We can do it using a function. We have the set type function for that purpose, and it's just set type, and then in parentheses 2 arguments, the item that's being cast into another type, comma, and then the second argument is the type that we want to set it to. So in this case, it's going to either convert var to be an integer or make sure that it already is an integer. Notice that integer is in quotes. It's a string that we're passing in. The other way that we can set type is by simply writing the name of the desired type in parentheses before the item being cast. So for example, parentheses integer, close parentheses, space, and then the item that we want to cast. Notice that there's not quotes around integer in this case. We're just putting integer right there between the parentheses. It's not a string, it is just an instruction to PHP. And this is the syntax of how it's done in the C programming language. That's where this comes from. The types that we can use, the values that we can provide for typecasting are the different types that we've seen so far. You've got string, integer, or int for short, float, array, boolean, or bool for short. Now for some of these it's going to be kind of obvious if we're converting an integer to a float or an integer to a string. It's pretty obvious the kind of conversion that it's going to make. But it's probably less obvious to you if you're going to convert the number 42 into a Boolean or convert an array to a string, what that kind of result is going to give you. You can try them in an experiment to see so you get a feel for what they do, or the php.net website actually has a list of the rules that explains how it converts from one type to the other. And so you can look those up. Let's create a page where we can do some experiments and play with both type juggling and typecasting. So let's start by opening up basic.html. We'll do save as. I'm going to call this page type_casting.php, even though it's technically going to be for both type juggling and typecasting. Typecasting is probably the more common term that people use to refer to it, mostly because it's the thing that we have control over. So let's start out by just putting type juggling in the HTML here. And then let's put a bit of PHP in. We'll define count is going to be equal to a string that is 2. Okay, so it's equal to a string. And we can find out what type it is. We can certainly use isString, isInt, those kinds of queries that we learned when we were learning those types. But an even better way to do it is to put echo get type. So we're going to just ask it to get back the type of count for us. I'll put a BR tag at the end. So that's going to report back. Now we know what the type of that is. It's pretty obvious. The type is a string. Even though it's a number, it's going to be a string. So now let's do a little bit of PHP, and let's add count plus equals 3. We saw this before when we were looking at integers. So let's do get type again, and then let's just bring up that page so we can have a look. Here we are. Instead of null, I need type_casting.php. So type juggling starts out being a string, and then it converts it to an integer. So count got converted when we added +3 to it, right? The type was converted. It knew, even though you started with a string, if I'm going to add these two things together, I'm going to need to have integers. And so it does the conversion for you. That's type juggling. PHP tries to make it work out for you. And we saw that if we had 2 cats, for example, that the same thing, reload the page, it still works just fine. It still goes ahead and adds them together. We could output the count and you would see that it was equal to 5. Now I can also see type juggling going back the other way. Let's convert our integer back to a string by concatenating it with 2 other strings. Here I have cats equal to a string followed by what is now an integer. Remember, we ended up with an integer here, and then another string. And when we get type on that, we'll see what that returns to us. Let's bring this up, reload the page, and it's back to being a string again. And that's because it said, hey, I'm going to concatenate a string, an integer, and a string. Well, if I'm doing concatenation, I need to turn those all into a string. And so it juggles it back to a string for us. Now, I think that this second one, using an integer to a string, is not such a bad thing to do. And I think you'll see that happen a lot in people's PHP code. Because the conversion from an integer to a string is super simple, right? And it's something that we're probably going to be doing a lot. However, I think in other cases, like here, when we're converting a string into an integer, or especially if we're doing more complex conversions, maybe you're trying to convert an array into an integer, right? That seems like a much more extreme example. It's sloppy programming to rely on PHP to do the switching for you. It's much better for you to make the change yourself. So I wouldn't say that you can never do type juggling, because I think you'll find me doing this kind of thing in my code all the time, but you won't find me doing this kind of thing in my code. I think that's the kind of thing in my mind that would be considered sloppy programming. So how do we make the change ourselves? Let's give ourselves a BR tag here, and then let's do type casting BR. So we talked about the two ways that we can do typecasting. One is to use a function. So we have the setType function. We're going to go ahead and use that same variable count, but this time it ended up as a string here. Now we're going to change it back into an integer. And we can do getType on that and see what that is. Let's just bring that up and try it real quick. There you go. It cast it back to an integer. It was a string. Here we changed it back to an integer. The other way that we can do it is by using that declaration in front of it, right? String, in parentheses. This is not a string itself. It's just the word string inside parentheses right before count. And I'm setting count2 equal to that value. And then we can compare. We can see what count equals and what count2 equals. So let's bring this up and let's try it. There we go. Now notice count1 is still an integer. Count2 is a string. And this is an important point about the difference between doing it these two different ways. setType changes it in place. It actually just affects the variable right where it is and changes its type. It recasts it in place. This one does not do that. And we could actually, if we take this away, you would see the difference, and you would see that it doesn't recast it. Let's make that point a little more explicit. Let's just make a BR tag here, and I'll do PHP $test1 is equal to the number 3, and then we'll do that same thing, but we'll make test2, so we'll have two of them. They're absolutely identical. And then let's set the type both ways. So let's try the first one. We're going to use setType, and we'll do it to test1, and its type is going to be string. We're going to explicitly convert it. Then in the next one, let's just do it by putting string and then test2. Okay, see what I'm doing? I'm just setting the type both ways here. Now, let's test the type for both of them. I'll just grab one of these lines up here, use that as a starting point, but we're going to call it test1 and test1. We'll echo back that value, and then do the same thing for test2. Okay, so let's bring that up and let's take a look. Reload the page, and you see the first one was changed to a string. The second one was not changed. It still is an integer. This change did not last. It only takes place as it's being used. In this case up here, as it's being assigned. The conversion is happening during the assignment. It's not making a permanent change to the item itself. So it's important for us while we're programming to be aware of what type something has. Is it an integer or is it a string? And then to use typecasting when we need to convert it to something else.